Hi everyone, before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It helps me out a lot and contributes a lot to the channel. Please also stay to the end of the story for a surprise. Now let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. From the moment dusk stretched its purple shadows across the palace courtyard, everyone in Silvercrest Pack felt the weight of a secret rumor that had lingered for years. In hushed corners of the great hall, in the echoing corridors that wind beneath the throne room, and even among the younger wolves who roamed the palace grounds in search of adventure, there were always whispered stories about the beast locked beneath the palace. Some said he was once an alpha who lost his mind and slaughtered half his pack in a blind rage, while others blamed a curse cast by the moon goddess herself. It was said that this creature had eyes so bright they could pierce darkness, a terrible strength that defied silver chains, and a growl so menacing that it shook the very stones of the dungeon walls. Amara, a she-wolf with bright hazel eyes and a calm, thoughtful manner, had grown up hearing these stories. She had always thought them to be overblown myths designed to scare misbehaving pups. She was the adopted daughter of one of the highest-ranking betas and had been raised to be a model of grace, intellect, and loyalty to the pack. The prospect of an arranged union with an alpha was all but guaranteed. After all, her lineage, though not purely royal, was influential, and she had long been told of her noble destiny. But a creeping sense of unease worked its way into her thoughts whenever someone mentioned the beast in passing. She could not explain why the rumor pricked at her curiosity more than it should. Perhaps, she told herself, she was merely susceptible to the allure of a mystery left unsolved, especially one that was so taboo it was scarcely discussed beyond whispered references. Late one evening, just as the glow of the moon was rising, Amara found herself leaning against a stone balustrade on one of the palace balconies. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and fading autumn leaves. She was supposed to be focusing on her upcoming engagement ceremony to Silas, the future alpha of Silvercrest, a promising young leader with strong ties to surrounding packs. It was the sort of union that would guarantee stability. She had been taught that love was something that often followed after a well-made match, that faded bonds were sometimes overshadowed by political necessity. Yet she wondered whether such a pragmatic approach to choosing mates would ever bring her true happiness. Something in her heart ached for something deeper, something that no political arrangement could replicate. As she stared into the night sky, something in the cold wind made the hair on her arms stand on end. She felt a subtle shift in the air, as though the ground beneath the palace were sighing. She was not a seer nor possessed of any oracular gift, but a chill came over her, an inexplicable dread, as though she sensed the presence of a caged beast beneath the stone floors. A swirl of curiosity and something more primal, something she could not name, pushed at the edges of her consciousness. She shook off the feeling, telling herself she was merely letting old stories unnerve her. Yet it lingered. Silvercrest Pack's palace was imposing. Large pillars lined the entrance, and a grand marble staircase led to a set of towering double doors. Inside, elegantly carved wooden walls were adorned with tapestries that depicted legendary battles and genealogies of famous alphas. Torches burned brightly throughout the corridors, illuminating austere suits of armor that stood as silent sentinels. Beyond those corridors, deeper down, were the dungeons, where all manner of secrets were rumored to be kept. Even though she had grown up in this environment, wandering the palace hallways as a child, Amara had never ventured into the dungeons. It was considered off-limits to anyone who was not on official guard duty or who had not been directly summoned. That evening, she walked quietly through one of the lesser-used hallways, letting her mind drift to the question of who the beast truly was, or whether it was just a monstrous tale. Her footsteps echoed across polished marble, and all she could hear otherwise was the distant drip of water somewhere deeper underground. She knew she should return to her rooms to rest, to clear her mind for the upcoming ceremony in a few days, but something tugged at her heart. The wise, rational part of her scolded her for indulging this compulsion, but a spark within her yearned for the truth, even if it was the kind of truth no one spoke about in polite society. As she passed a small, intricately carved wooden door that led down to the lower levels, she froze. The faintest reverberation, like a low, distant growl, carried through the crack beneath the door. It could have been the rumble of shifting earth, or perhaps a guard's hound kept in the basement. Yet it felt sentient, alive, vibrating through her, making her pulse throb. Amara pressed her hand against the door. For a moment, she thought to push it open, to see for herself whether the legend was real, but fear anchored her in place, and she retreated. She was not foolish enough to roam the dungeons alone in the dead of night. That night, she dreamed. She saw 2 golden eyes in the darkness. They looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. The eyes were not full of malice, though they blazed like a predator's. They seemed almost to plead with her. She heard her name on the wind, carried by a mournful howl, and she stumbled forward into an endless black corridor. The sound of chains scraping stone followed her, and a sense of foreboding weighed on her chest like a heavy stone. When she awoke, her body was drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around her legs. She could not shake the feeling that the creature from her dream had recognized her. The next morning, she stepped into her daily routine. As the prospective mate of Silas, the future alpha, she was expected to walk at his side during public events, attend strategy meetings, and become familiar with the intricacies of diplomatic negotiations. Silas was handsome in a princely way, tall and broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that could silence a room with a single look. Yet behind his cultivated charm, Amara often felt that there was something missing between them. He had a polite air, treating her with courtesy, but never had she sensed the blossoming spark of passion that she always believed a true mate bond would bring. At midday, she walked the perimeter of the training grounds while Silas and the warriors sparred. She tried to hide her absent gaze behind feigned interest, clapping politely whenever Silas pinned his opponents or displayed impressive speed. Throughout the session, she felt an unexplainable prickling at the back of her neck, as though being observed by someone unseen. She turned repeatedly, scanning the crowd of onlookers, but she saw only the usual pack members, cooks and stable hands gathered around the arena fence. No one returned her searching gaze with particular scrutiny, yet the sensation remained. During a brief break, Silas pulled her aside. He was breathing heavily from exertion, but a self-satisfied grin tugged at his lips. "I hope you are watching," he said, voice full of easy confidence. "Our pack must be the strongest in the region if we are to maintain peace. Once we're mated officially, we can work together to keep any threats at bay." Amara offered a polite, if distant, smile. "Yes, you're quite skilled, Silas." She paused, uncertain how to express the sense of restlessness she felt. "Do you really think that we thought I was meant for this? Sometimes I wonder if the moon goddess has other designs." She realized how silly her words sounded. Many in the pack believed the goddess orchestrated fated mates, but arranged political unions still happened, and they rarely led to dissatisfaction. It was how the pack had secured alliances for centuries. His eyes flickered with something like impatience. "Destiny is what we make of it. I can think of no better arrangement than ours. Our families approve, and it strengthens the pack. We will do well together, you'll see." Amara forced her smile to remain in place, though deep inside she could not deny the persistent sense of something unfulfilled. She yearned to ask him about the rumor of the beast in the dungeon, to see if Silas had knowledge of it that he would confide in her. But it was an odd question to pose out of the blue, and she suspected he would dismiss it as nonsense, or find it an unfit topic for his future Luna. She did not want to appear naive or superstitious, so she bit her tongue. That evening, as the last wisps of sun painted the horizon in warm gold, a small group of senior warriors gathered in the main hall to discuss possible threats from rogue wolves who prowled the outskirts of their territory. Amara, in her capacity as the future Luna, was invited to observe. Chairs of polished oak were arranged in a semicircle, and a large map of Pack territory covered an ornate table in the center of the room. Torches cast flickering light on the faces of the council, each of them serious and stern. It was there that she heard a mention of the beast from Cororin, an older man with silver hair and a stern, haunted expression. He spoke in a hushed tone, but Amara's ears perked up. He seemed to be suggesting that if any rogue was captured, they might be thrown into the same place they kept the monstrous figure. Another council member immediately changed the subject. Amara's heart pounded. Clearly the beast was no fairy tale. But why keep him alive if he was as dangerous as rumor suggested? She managed to maintain her composure, though the conversation had abruptly turned to the logistics of border patrols. She let her gaze drift among the council members, noting that a few of them looked uneasy, as though uncertain whether they should acknowledge the existence of what lay beneath their feet. Before the meeting concluded, Silas offered a vague comment about enemies contained below, which only fueled Amara's curiosity. When the council adjourned, everyone rose and murmured farewells. Instead of joining them, Amara lingered by the table, pretending to inspect a region of the map. In truth, she was waiting for an opportunity to speak with Cororin. He was among the last to leave, walking with a slight limp from an old battle injury. She touched his arm gently to catch his attention. "Cororin," she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one else could overhear. "May I ask you something in confidence?" His eyes narrowed with concern. "Of course, my lady." He spoke with a respect that told her he recognized her high standing, that there was also a fatherly gentleness behind his stern gaze. He had known her since she was a child, after all. Steeling herself, she murmured, "It's about the creature, the one beneath the palace." He tensed visibly, his jaw clenching. "That is a dangerous subject, best left alone." She inhaled, struggling with her impulse to press for information. "Please, I only want to understand. Is he truly a beast, or is he someone else? Someone who lost control?" She felt her cheeks flush at her own curiosity. Something gnawed at her gut, demanding more clarity. Corin's gaze flickered across the chamber to check if anyone was listening. Then he whispered, "I don't know the whole story, my lady, only fragments, but I can confirm that he is indeed a werewolf, bound by something dark. The official story is that he arrived one night, delirious and in chains, brought by a traveling party from a distant land. He was thrown into our dungeon at the request of the old Alpha. None can say exactly why, or what he had done. Some claim the old Alpha owed a debt to another pack, and that debt was repaid by holding this a creature. Some say curses swirl around him, or that he devoured entire villages. Whatever the truth, he has been locked away for so many years that only a handful of us know he still lives." Amara swallowed, her heart thudding so loudly it filled her ears. But if he is just a man lost in madness, can he not be helped? Cororin looked at her sadly. "That is a question that cannot be answered lightly. I have heard his growls echo in the darkness. My lady, they are not the growls of a sane wolf. It is said he kills on sight, that silver and wolfsbane are barely enough to keep him subdued, and that every few nights he tests the strength of his chains. Howling like a wounded animal. For your own safety, do not seek him out. If the goddess has mercy on us, he will never see the light of day again. For a long moment she could not speak. The notion of a man so far gone he was no longer recognized as a man at all made her blood turn cold. Yet a flicker of empathy sparked inside her, as though she imagined the absolute torment of being imprisoned year after year, with no hope of release, no comfort, no sense of dignity. She thanked Beta Cororin for his candor, and left the chamber with her thoughts in turmoil. Night fell, and she retired to her chambers, but sleep eluded her again. This time, she did not dream. Instead, she lay awake with the heavy knowledge that the beast was no child's tale. She felt dread, but also curiosity. A part of her suspected that there was something about this entire situation that did not ring true. Why would the old alpha harbor such a creature without a clear reason? And why keep him alive for so long? She wondered if the current alpha, Silas's father, had inherited this burden. The thought made her skin prickle. The following day, as dawn light softened the sky, she slipped out of her room. She wore a simple cloak to avoid drawing attention. An irresistible urge compelled her to see more, to confirm with her own eyes what everyone feared. She had no illusions that confronting a dangerous beast would be wise, but she hoped to at least reach the outer edges of the dungeon corridor, to glean some sense of the place. She told herself she only wanted to quell the nightmares and ensure that the rumor was not some twisted exaggeration. The entrance to the dungeons was guarded by 2 warriors at all times, but at the changing of the guard, there was a brief moment where she might slip past if she was careful. She waited, breathing shallowly, listening from behind a large stone column. The guards chatted briefly about the weather. One left, heading upstairs, and a few moments later, another approached from the far corridor. In that slim gap of time, the door was left momentarily unguarded. Amara seized the opportunity and slipped inside, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her presence. A narrow spiral staircase led down, the air growing colder and damper with every step. Her senses were acute, her ears pricked for any sign that she was not alone. Flickering torches in rusted iron sconces provided dim light at intervals, illuminating the rough stone walls. She felt claustrophobic. On some level, she wanted to turn back, yet she pressed on, driven by a powerful intuition that some crucial truth lay hidden in these depths. The steps ended at a corridor lined with metal-barred cells on either side. Most of them were empty, though a couple housed minor criminals or rogues awaiting judgment. They looked at her with sullen, hopeless eyes, but no one called out. Perhaps they feared retribution if they drew too much attention. At the far end of the corridor was a heavy iron gate, its bars coated with a faint shimmer that suggested silver. 2 additional guards stood watch there, looking bored yet vigilant. Through the bars, the corridor seemed to curve, descending further underground. She guessed that was the restricted area where the beast was held. As she considered how to approach, a sudden vibration traveled through the floor. It was like a faint quake, or a large creature shifting. A low, rumbling growl seeped through the gate, rolling across the dungeon in a way that made her blood run cold. The guards instantly tensed, exchanging uneasy glances, but they did not flee. Instead, they gripped their silver-tipped spears more tightly, bracing themselves. Amara's throat constricted. She wanted to see, to know, But there was no way she could sneak past these two without causing a ruckus. Her rational mind told her to flee before she got herself arrested for trespassing. She started to turn, intending to leave. But at that moment, she felt a strange pull, like an invisible hand tugging her forward. It was unlike anything she had experienced. She managed to take a single step before caution seized her. The primal part of her soul recognized danger, yet something else inside her roared to life, hungry for answers. She fled up the stairs, her cloak rustling, barely hearing the guards call out at the sound of movement. Once back on the main level, she leaned against a corridor wall, panting. Her heart hammered, and her entire body shook with adrenaline. The beast was indeed real, strong enough that even a single growl could freeze a person in place. She wondered what manner of man was chained in those depths, and more importantly, why she felt that strange compulsion pulling her to him. It felt almost like an echo, as if something inside her recognized a piece of him. She returned to her chambers just before her maid, Lydia, came to deliver fresh linens. Striving for composure, she offered a polite greeting and pretended to be engrossed in reorganizing her closet. Once Lydia left, Amara sank onto her bed, letting out a shaky breath. She could not discuss her discovery with anyone, not without risking punishment or ridicule. Yet she felt more certain than ever that something fated, something bigger than her engagement to Silas, was beginning to unfold. Her introspection was interrupted by a knock at the door. Silas's voice drifted through, announcing his presence. She hastily composed herself, smoothing her hair and dress. When she opened the door, he offered a charming smile, though his brow furrowed slightly. "I came to see if you wanted to take a walk in the gardens." "You seem restless," he observed, his tone suggesting mild concern. She mustered a gentle nod. "A walk would be lovely." She followed him through the palace corridors and out into the gardens, where neatly trimmed hedges and rose bushes adorned winding paths. He spoke about the upcoming ceremony, the details of the feast, the pack's allied guests, and all the formalities involved in forging new treaties. She listened politely, but her mind kept drifting. Every time he paused to ask her opinion, she scrambled to reply with something suitable. She felt guilty for her lack of engagement, but she could not quell the sense that her life had just changed irrevocably in the dungeon corridor. At length they passed a quiet koi pond, and Silas stopped to admire the shimmering fish. He turned to her, and for a moment, the seriousness in his gaze reminded her that he was more than just a prospective mate. He would one day hold the fate of the entire Silvercrest Pack in his hands. "Amara, is something troubling you? If you have reservations about our union, you must tell me." Caught off guard, she fumbled for words. "I know. It's not that. Well, maybe it is. I don't question the importance of our partnership for the pack, but sometimes I wonder if we are truly meant, if we truly share the bond that werewolves speak of. The pull, the unbreakable connection of fated mates." Silas exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "That bond is rare. Many alphas and lunas come together by arrangement and learn to love each other deeply. I do not want you to feel forced, but this is our responsibility. It's a great honor. In time, we will grow closer, and perhaps the goddess will bless us with a spark of that bond as we fulfill our duties." She nodded, though her heart twisted uncomfortably. She yearned to be honest about the swirling instincts within her, the sense that something else was calling her. But how could she possibly speak of that? He would think her delirious for being fascinated with a monster rumored to be locked below. So she kept silent, forcing a gracious smile. The days edged closer to the engagement ceremony, and the palace buzzed with preparations. Festive banners were hung, the kitchens worked tirelessly, and the seamstresses fussed over Amara's attire, adjusting every lace and embroidered pattern to perfection. She stood before a wide mirror as they tailored the final touches, the satin of her dress gleaming with a regal silver hue. She looked the part of a future Luna, yet she felt a hollowness she could not dispel. On the eve of the ceremony, a lavish banquet was held to welcome guests from neighboring packs. Long tables were piled high with roasted meats, fresh bread, spiced vegetables, and countless delicacies. Musicians played soft tunes that drifted through the grand hall. Amara circulated among the guests on Silas's arm, wearing a polite smile, exchanging pleasantries, and accepting congratulations on her upcoming engagement. At one point, she politely excused herself to catch her breath on one of the balconies. The cool night air offered a reprieve from the thick warmth of the banquet hall. Torches illuminated the courtyard below, and the lively music drifted out into the night. She closed her eyes, letting the crisp breeze sweep over her. Then, abruptly, a chill ran down her spine. The same primal pull she had felt in the dungeon corridor returned, a humming awareness that made her pulse quicken. Her gaze dropped to the courtyard below, searching for some explanation. She saw no one out of the ordinary, only well-dressed guests or patrolling guards. Yet the feeling persisted, so strong that she had to grip the balustrade to steady herself. A strange image flashed in her mind, those fierce golden eyes, locked onto hers. She had not seen the beast's face, but she knew somehow that his eyes were gold. The flicker of recognition she had felt in the dream came rushing back, stirring an inexplicable pang in her chest. She wanted to ignore it, to label it as a figment of her imagination, but it felt too real. If only she had answers. That night, she hardly slept. Her restlessness culminated in a final, vivid dream just before dawn. She stood in a dark forest, surrounded by towering pines. The moon hung high in the sky, casting silver shadows on the mossy ground. Ahead of her stood a massive wolf, its fur so dark it seemed carved from midnight, and its eyes glowed like embers. It was not the typical size of a regular werewolf in half shift or a normal wolf. It was monstrous, powerfully built, and its presence shook the air. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt drawn forward. The wolf lowered its head and sniffed the air, as though testing her scent. She realized she was not afraid, even as it bared its fangs. There was an unspoken communication, a sense that it recognized her, that it would not harm her. Then the sky seemed to tear, the forest ripping apart around them in a whirlwind of blackness and storms. She heard chains rattle. The wolf roared in pain, and she reached out, desperate to help, but the scene dissolved into chaos. She bolted upright, gasping, drenched in sweat. The dream left her trembling with an adrenaline that refused to fade. Somehow, she knew the beast was not just a mindless creature. He was more, and he was calling to her, and for reasons she could scarcely understand, she knew that she was meant to answer. Morning arrived, and with it, the engagement ceremony was set to begin. The palace courtyard was decorated with bright banners, and rows of chairs were set up around a raised dais. Pack members, allied dignitaries, and curious bystanders filled the seats. A hush fell over the gathering when the officiant arrived, followed by Silas, wearing a finely embroidered tunic and a solemn expression. Then Amara stepped forward, her dress shimmering, her hair pinned back with silver clips. She tried to steady her breathing, focusing on the kind, supportive faces in the crowd. She spotted Beta Cororin among them, his expression unreadable but not unkind. The officiants started the formalities, extolling the virtues of unity between noble lines, praising the decades of peace that such alliances had brought. Amara's hands trembled as she placed them in Silas's, trying to ignore the wild pounding of her heart. She felt numb, as if she were floating outside her own body, watching this spectacle. The officiant asked them to exchange words of commitment, for this was not the final mating ceremony, but the formal engagement leading up to it. Silas spoke confidently about his dedication to the pack, and to her, about building a future worthy of their people. The crowd applauded politely. When it was her turn, her throat constricted. She managed to say the scripted words of loyalty, to praise Silas's leadership and the promise of a strong bond. But all the while, a voice in her mind cried out that something was wrong, that this union, though valuable to the pack, was not the bond she was destined for. Her inner wolf stirred, restless, as though sensing a fundamental betrayal. She finished her vows, though they sounded hollow to her own ears, and she felt a flicker of guilt when she caught Silas's satisfied nod. Just as the officiant was raising his arms to declare the engagement sealed, a quake-like tremor rocked the courtyard. It was a deep vibration that rattled chairs and sent gasps through the crowd. Some of the guests even stumbled. The officiant paused, clearly alarmed, while Silas spun around, scanning the perimeter. The entire pack seemed to sense a surge of power emanating from below, as if the dungeon itself had roared in protest. In that charged moment, Amara heard a distant howl, carrying up through the very foundation of the palace. It was furious, anguished, and it resonated inside her chest like a tolling bell. A murmur of fear spread among the crowd. A few of the older pack members whispered, "The beast he stirs." Amara's heart slammed against her ribs. She realized that the strange quake and the tortured howl were not separate phenomena. The beast was reacting, perhaps to her engagement. But how could that be? As fear and confusion rippled through the assembly, the officiant attempted to proceed, urging calm. Silas placed a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder, but his expression was uneasy, a glimmer of knowledge in his eyes that told her he understood something was amiss. Within minutes, guards rushed into the courtyard, urging the crowd to disperse while they investigated. A wave of tension crackled through the air, and the engagement ceremony lay in disarray. The officiant quickly concluded with a truncated blessing. The sense of joy and celebration evaporated, replaced by a quiet dread. People murmured that if the beast was angry enough to shake the entire palace from his cell, then something dire must be coming. Amara's hands felt cold. She could still sense the remnants of that howl reverberating through her bones. For an instant, she thought she felt his presence, like an echo of the monstrous creature calling out to her soul. She sensed a peculiar pang within her, almost like heartbreak. The pack began filtering out of the courtyard, eyes darting about in worry. Silas guided her inside, but her mind was elsewhere. She realized then, with a burst of clarity, that the beast recognized her on a level that transcended logic, and that her fate was now inextricably woven with his. She did not know how or why, only that the illusions of her old life had been shattered. That night, the palace vibrated with tension, the guards more numerous, the corridors patrolled with silver-armed warriors. An emergency council meeting was called. Amara was not invited, presumably because her presence was overshadowed by more urgent concerns. She retreated to the solitude of her room, but she could not rest. Every instinct in her body insisted that something monumental had begun, that the beast's reaction was tied to her. Her mind spun with possibility, confusion, and fear. The single question that haunted her was, had the moon goddess truly chosen him as her mate, a monstrous creature that everyone else feared and despised? And if so, why? She wrapped her arms around herself, standing near her window, staring into the moonlit courtyard below. She sensed the beast in every breath, an uncanny awareness that he was somewhere beneath her feet, raging in the darkness. Her engagement to Silas seemed suddenly hollow, a superficial arrangement that would never quiet the call thrumming through her veins. She shuddered, torn between duty and the emerging truth she could no longer deny. If the quake that interrupted her ceremony was any indication, the beast would not remain silent, and she, for reasons she could scarcely comprehend, would be the key to unlocking the secrets of who he was, what he had done, and whether he could ever be freed. Eventually, the moon climbed high, and exhaustion enveloped her. But in the depths of her dreams, she once again stood face to face with the massive black wolf, his golden eyes gleaming with an intensity that shook her to the core. This time she did not flinch or step back. She reached out a trembling hand, feeling the thunder of his heartbeat echoing her own. In the silence of that dreamscape, a gentle murmur brushed against her thoughts, as if the wolf were trying to speak. But before words could form, the dream dissolved. She woke in darkness, her chest tight, tears staining her cheeks for reasons she could not articulate. She knew, beyond doubt, that her path had changed. What she did not know was whether she had the strength to face the consequences of a bond that defied everything her pack believed. Even as dawn broke, and light filtered through the palace windows, an unsettled quiet clung to the corridors. The courtyard, once filled with decorations for the aborted ceremony, now looked bleak. The remnants of the half-finished celebration scattered about. Guards roamed in pairs, casting suspicious glances at every shadow. People whispered of the beast's roar, rumored to be an omen of catastrophe. They spoke in muted tones about how Silas's engagement to Amara had been overshadowed by an unnatural quake that seemed to issue from below, as though the earth itself had protested the union. Amara emerged from her chambers, her eyes ringed with fatigue, her heart weighed down by uncertainty. She could feel the tension radiating in every hallway. The staff, usually cheerful and ready with morning greetings, were subdued. As she made her way toward the breakfast hall, she overheard bits of hushed conversation. They whispered that the council had convened an emergency session well into the night, though no one knew exactly what decisions had been made. Some speculated they might execute the beast at last. Others thought they would reinforce his cell with more silver or bring in witches from distant lands to contain him. Amara's heart constricted at the notion of him being put to death, a wave of emotion surging within her that she could barely comprehend. In the breakfast hall, she found Silas seated at the head table, his brow furrowed in deep thought. A few elders flanked him, their faces grim. She approached cautiously, sensing the weight of the conversation she was intruding upon. Silas stood up when he saw her, forcing a tight smile. "Amara, good morning," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. She inclined her head. "Good morning." She looked to the elders, men she had known for most of her life, and saw mirrored apprehension in their eyes. "Has something happened?" she asked. "Has the beast been contained?" Silas exchanged a glance with the elders before replying. "For the moment, yes. He is still in his cell, but the quake that was no minor disturbance. Some of the guards were hurt when debris fell in one of the lower tunnels." A troubled edge sharpened his tone. "He's stronger than we realized, and we suspect that even the silver bars are only barely enough to hold him." Amara's stomach churned with guilt and fear. She had been raised to respect the pack's security above all else, but she could not shake the feeling that she was involved in some intangible way. "Is the council planning to deal with him?" she asked, her voice wavering. She forced herself to remain composed, but inside, alarm bells rang. She imagined a savage showdown in the dungeon, the beast cornered and wounded, howling with agony. One of the elders, an imposing man named Elder Rowan, nodded grimly. "We are considering all options. Beta Cororin is verifying the structural integrity of the dungeon cells to ensure the beast cannot break free. We would prefer not to kill him if we can avoid it. Such a creature is a bay. Valuable bargaining piece, or at least he was in the old Alpha's time. Yet if he threatens the palace itself, we have no choice but to prioritize the safety of our own." Amara swallowed hard, thankful that they had not already ordered an execution. But fear gnawed at her. "I see," she managed. "Do you know why he reacted so strongly last night? At precisely the moment of the ceremony?" Silas frowned, his gaze briefly flickering with suspicion. "We don't know. Perhaps it was random, or perhaps the tension of the gathering reached him somehow, though he's never shown such a synchronized response before." Her heart hammered. She quickly diverted her eyes, hoping no one could see the tumult brewing within her. She sensed that no one here guessed the true reason. Even she could not fully explain it, but she felt an unbreakable tie to the beast that had manifested in that catastrophic howl. She took a seat at the table, nibbling on a piece of bread without tasting it, feeling Silas's watchful gaze on her. She tried to appear calm, but every nerve in her body was on edge. Later that morning, after the elders dispersed to attend to their duties, Silas approached her privately. They stood in a sunlit alcove overlooking the training grounds. Warriors moved below, engaged in drills, but the air was charged with a sense of vigilance. "Amara," Silas said softly, searching her face. "Talk to me. Are you truly all right? I fear yesterday's events have shaken you more than you show." She forced a wary smile. "I am as all right as can be, considering what happened." She paused, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. "I heard we might have witches brought in to reinforce the silver spells around his cell. Is that true?" Silas nodded. "Yes, it's one of the suggestions on the table. The council is discussing costs and time. Witches who can handle such tasks are not easy to find, but if it ensures that monster can't break free, they'll consider it." Her heart squeezed painfully at the word monster. She reminded herself that to everyone else, he truly was a terror. "And if that doesn't work?" she ventured. Silas's jaw tightened. "We do what must be done. The safety of the pack is paramount." A sense of finality clung to his words, though he said it gently, as if trying to spare her fragile sensibilities. The notion of the beast's death sent a spike of anxiety through her. She masked it by turning away, gazing out at the warriors who swung wooden swords in a training exercise. "I understand," she said, forcing an even tone. "I only hope it does not come to that." When Silas left to confer with his father, the current Alpha, Amara wandered the corridors aimlessly, searching for a sense of clarity. She was surprised when she found Beta Cororin leaning against a wall near one of the library entrances, his arms folded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. He beckoned her over. "Amara," he said quietly, "I had a feeling you might be troubled after what happened." He hesitated a moment, as though weighing his words. "I know you asked me about the beast before. If you have questions, I might be able to offer what little knowledge I possess. But we must keep this discreet. Many do not even want to speak his name." Grateful for a chance to confide in someone, she nodded. Together, they slipped into the library, a place rarely frequented in times of turmoil. Shelves lined with old tomes and scrolls towered around them. Soft light streamed through high windows, creating a sanctuary of knowledge and dust motes. Cororin led her to a quiet corner where a small table stood surrounded by tall shelves. She voiced the question that had tormented her since the quake. Why did he react at that particular moment yesterday? The quake is how they felt deliberate, as though in response to something. She stopped short of mentioning that she felt personally tied to the event, fearing Cororin might think her delusional. The beta exhaled slowly, drawing a hand through his silver-streaked hair. I wish I had a definitive answer. In my years serving this pack, I've learned that werewolves can sometimes sense pivotal moments, shifts in power or emotional surges, especially those with heightened gifts. But the beast he's always been a mystery. Perhaps he is more attuned to the energies around him than we realize. She recalled the stories of him being cursed, of powerful dark magic clinging to him. Could it be that he was once an alpha? She asked carefully, her voice echoing in the hush of the library. I heard rumors he lost control, and alphas have an unusual bond with the pack's essence. Maybe he sensed something changing, like a new leadership or an official alliance. Cororin's gaze drifted to a towering shelf, as though reading invisible text. It's possible. I've heard conflicting accounts. Some claim he was indeed an alpha from a faraway pack. Others believe he was a rogue with insatiable bloodlust. Cursed by the goddess for atrocities, no one truly knows because he has never spoken a word since being imprisoned. He remains half feral, shifting uncontrollably, lashing out at any who come near. Amara's heart beat faster. He can't talk, or he just won't. The beta hesitated. When I first came here as a young warrior, the guards told me they heard him speak fragments of a name in his more lucid moments. But whenever they asked for clarity, he would revert to snarls and attempts to break free. Over time, that minimal speech faded to nothing. The official stance is that he's too dangerous to be reasoned with. She felt a pang of sorrow, imagining a proud alpha, stripped of reason and locked away in the dark. But if he used to speak, maybe there's still a glimmer of who he was, locked somewhere within him. Maybe he's not entirely lost. Cororin studied her with a discerning eye. That's a kind thought, Amara. But remember, people have died by his hand. Even the guards who feed him do so through a special mechanism to avoid direct contact. It's wise to remember that compassion can be a dangerous weakness when dealing with such a beast. A hush settled over them. The only sound the faint rustle of old pages. After a moment, Cororin stepped away, pulling a thick tome from a shelf. He flipped through its yellowed pages, scanning for a relevant passage. This is a record of pack history dating back decades, he explained in a near whisper. It might mention something about the time he arrived. He paused on a page that depicted a brief mention of a traveling delegation from a distant pack known as Thornridge, rumored to have once sought sanctuary, or an exchange of some kind. The exact details were vague, but there was a cryptic line referencing a prisoner delivered to the dungeons. The date corresponded roughly with the time the older wolves estimated the beast's arrival. It mentioned that this prisoner was of particular interest to the old alpha, who believed he might contain the seeds of corruption or the seeds of power. Amara read the line again, her eyebrows furrowing. Seeds of corruption or seeds of power. It sounds like the old alpha believed there was something special, maybe something extremely powerful, about him. Cororin nodded gravely. Yes, he believed that if the beast could be controlled, it might become a formidable weapon. Or if it was truly cursed, it needed to be contained to avoid spreading darkness. We may never know which was true, The old Alpha took that secret to his grave. She swallowed the lump in her throat. So he's been down there all these years, living a nightmare. Cororin gently shut the book, returning it to the shelf. I know your heart, Amara. You've always been empathetic, but be careful. It's not your responsibility to save him, especially if it endangers us all. She nodded numbly, though her thoughts were already spinning scenarios of secret visits to the dungeon, attempts to communicate with the beast, a desperate hope that she might help him reclaim some shred of sanity. She thanked Cororin for his time and left the library with a newfound sense of urgency swirling inside her. Unable to quell the restless impulse gnawing at her, she decided to descend once more into the depths of the palace. The midday shift change for the guards offered a narrow window of opportunity, much like before. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she slipped past the corridors, her footsteps muffled by a pair of soft-soled shoes. She reached the top of the spiral staircase, peering down at the guard station. 2 warriors stood chanting, but she sensed a slight laxity in their vigilance. Timing her move carefully, she waited until they turned away, then descended the stairs swiftly, hugging the walls to keep out of their line of sight. At the bottom, she kept her cloak's hood up, though she doubted that would truly hide her identity if she was caught. She needed to approach the heavy silver gate that separated the main cells from the deeper dungeon. Today, a single guard stood there, looking weary and bored. The corridor was uncharacteristically empty of other prisoners. She wondered if they had been moved elsewhere for safety. The air smelled damp, laced with the metallic tang of silver. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Clinging to the shadows, she edged closer. Her mind spun with the question of how to proceed. She had no realistic plan to get beyond the gate without alerting the guard. And what did she intend to do if she managed to slip inside? Attempt to speak with a monstrous werewolf known for his viciousness? The idea was ludicrous, yet the tug in her heart felt undeniable. She closed her eyes, inhaling the cold dungeon air, wrestling with her own conflicted sense of duty. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind her. Panicking, she pressed herself into the alcove of a disused cell door, pulling her cloak tightly around her. She held her breath as 2 more guards appeared, conferring with the single guard by the gate. One was a stocky man with a scar across his cheek, the other tall and lean with watchful eyes. The tall guard produced a large keyring, the metal jingling ominously. A low growl reverberated from the depths beyond the gate. He was quieter than the quake-inducing roar, but it held a menacing edge that sent shivers down Amara's spine. The guard with the keyring paused, his hand hovering over the gate lock. "I hate this duty," he muttered, voice tinged with fear. "We have to check the structural damage from that quake last night, but I'd rather face a den of rogues than go near that thing." The stocky guard nodded fervently. "At least we have the reinforced collar. Beta Cororin says the blacksmith hammered in extra silver, so hopefully it holds if he tries to lunge." A wave of pity and dread surged through Amara. They were opening the gate, intending to go deeper. She risked peeking from her hiding spot. The tall guard unlocked the gate, the metal screeching. All 3 guards stepped inside with obvious reluctance, their spears and silver blades at the ready. As soon as they disappeared down the curving corridor, the gate swung shut behind them. They left it unlocked, presumably for a quick retreat, though it was still physically closed. Amara's body trembled with uncertainty. She could run now, slink back upstairs, and pretend she had never come. But the wild compulsion inside her flared again, the invisible thread pulling her forward. Summoning a burst of reckless courage, she darted to the gate, easing it open just enough to slip through. She found herself in a narrower corridor, the walls hewn from rougher stone. torchlight was scarce, and an earthy scent of moss and stale air clung to every surface. The guards were several paces ahead, around a slight bend, their muttered conversation growing distant. Cautiously, she followed, staying far enough back to remain unseen. Her heart hammered. She had no idea what she would do if the guards spotted her, or if she came face to face with the beast. But she pressed on, the swirling in her blood refusing to be silenced. The corridor gradually descended, steps carved into the stone floor, until it opened into a wider circular chamber, lit by a single brazier that hung from the ceiling. Large metal doors branched off in several directions, but the guards paused at one to the left. It was thick and bolted, with runic etchings that glinted with silver dust. Amara crouched behind a low stack of supplies, watching as one guard slipped a key into the door's heavy lock. He glanced at his companions, who nodded grimly. The door opened with agonizing slowness, and beyond it lay a darkness broken only by the occasional reflection of torchlight on damp walls. The interior reeked of fear, a primal tang that made the hair on Amara's arms rise. She imagined she could smell old blood, rust, and the intangible stench of desperation. Her wolf senses were overloaded with the intensity of it all. She remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing, her gaze locked on the men as they inched into the cell. "Stay near the walls," she heard the scarred guard say, voice trembling. "He's chained, but you never know when he might lunge." Dimly, she could see a hulking figure at the far end of the space. Her first impression was of sheer size, an outline that was too large to be a normal wolf and too bestial to be an ordinary man. Chains rattled, and a low snarl filled the air, vibrating with savage hostility. Her breath caught in her throat. Even at a distance, she felt his presence like a wave of thick tension. He was half in shadow, but a torch on the wall illuminated enough to reveal matted black hair, hanging in disarray around his broad shoulders. He crouched near the floor, immense arms resting on the cold stone, naked, except for tattered remnants of cloth around his waist. His chest was roped with muscle, and a series of scars crisscrossed his back and arms, telling a story of endless battles with the silver chains that contained him. Her heart lurched when his face turned slightly, and she caught a glimpse of eyes glowing with an unearthly golden hue. They were not the eyes of a normal werewolf, but something darker, primal, laced with fury and torment. He bared his teeth, a guttural growl pouring from his throat. The guards flinched but held their ground, huddling close to the walls while one of them inspected the chains anchored into the stone. A massive silver collar encircled his neck, runes etched into its surface. She could practically sense the burn of silver on his flesh, the faint wisps of smoke that sometimes rose when silver made prolonged contact with werewolf skin. Time seemed to slow. She was transfixed, unable to tear her gaze away from the powerful, tortured figure. Was this truly her mate, as her instincts had begun to suggest? The idea defied reason, yet her body responded with a tumult of sensations, a confusing mix of empathy, dread, and something deeper, an inexplicable longing that made her legs feel weak. One guard knelt to check the stone floor for cracks or potential damage from the quake. The beast snarled again, muscles tensing as though to lunge, but he was kept in place by heavy restraints that looped from his collar to multiple iron rings in the walls. Every link in the chain looked as thick as her wrist. She watched his clawed hands grip the chains, the cords of his forearms bulging with monstrous strength. A part of her understood why the entire pack feared him. This was raw power bound by the narrowest margin of control, a raging storm contained in brittle chains. The tall guard stepped closer, hooking a measuring tool around the metal ring to test for stress. Suddenly, the beast jerked, letting out a furious roar. He yanked the chain with such force that the guard stumbled backward, nearly losing his balance. The others rushed in, their silver weapons raised, barking warnings. For a moment, chaos reigned as the beast roared, fighting the restraints, sending echoes through the chamber that threatened to collapse Amara's composure entirely. She covered her mouth to stifle a gasp, tears burning her eyes. She could feel his agony as if it were her own, the sense of entrapment, the unending torment. Against all better sense, she longed to reach out, to offer comfort, but the guards steadied themselves, cursing under their breath, and proceeded with their inspection as quickly as possible. They tightened a few bolts and tested the structural integrity of the anchor points. Minutes later, they cautiously backed out of the cell, slammed the door shut, and locked it with shaking hands. A wave of relief and sorrow washed over Amara. She remained hidden until the men left, hearing their footsteps fade back up the corridor. Only then did she dare approach the closed door. Her body trembled, adrenaline surging through her. She pressed her palm against the cold metal, feeling the faint vibrations of movement inside. She heard him breathing, ragged and heavy, like an animal recovering from a frenzy. Her rational mind screamed that this was madness. Yet something else inside her urged her not to run. Carefully, she lowered herself, peering through a small barred window set in the upper portion of the door. Torchlight flickered inside, revealing the monstrous figure slumped against the far wall. He was turned slightly away, but she could see the tension in his broad shoulders, the ragged rise and fall of his chest. The collar gleamed with malevolent silver. She sucked in a shaky breath, mustering the courage to whisper, "Can you hear me?" Her voice was barely above a hush, quivering in the still air. At first, there was no response. Then he froze, as though catching a scent or a sound. His head turned slowly, and she found herself staring into those burning golden eyes, each breath a struggle to remain calm. She expected him to roar again, to leap at the door, but instead, he just stared, his gaze locked on hers with an intensity that made her skin tingle. In that moment, she felt it like a shockwave. The bond, the intangible thread that linked them. It was real, so powerful that she nearly cried out. Her heart pounded, her wolf howling within, telling her that this man, this beast, was hers. It defied all logic, all the warnings and dread, but it was true. For several agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. Then the beast let out a sound that was half growl, half whimper. It tore through her heart more deeply than any roar. She placed her trembling hand against the door. Her eyes welled with tears she could not contain. I don't know if you understand me," she whispered, voice tight with emotion. "But I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say." He shifted, his chains clinking softly, and she heard a strangled sound in his throat, as if he was trying to speak but could not form the words. Her eyes widened in anguished empathy. She had never felt this kind of raw connection to anyone, not even the gentle wolves who had raised her, nor to Silas, her betrothed. It was terrifying and magnetic all at once. She forced herself to stand, every fiber of her being longing to tear open the door and kneel beside him, to do something to ease his pain. But she knew that was impossible. Even if the door were unlocked, it would be suicide to walk in there unprotected, or so reason insisted. Her wolf, however, whispered a different story, that he would never harm her, because he was hers as surely as she was his. The war within her, between reason and instinct, raged like a tempest. Footsteps echoed from the corridor again, presumably the returning guard. Panicking, she mouthed the word, "sorry," once more, then pulled her hood up and dashed away, retracing her steps up the winding passage before anyone could catch her. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she ran. She felt like a coward for leading him, but she had no choice. She could not let the guards discover her down there. If word got out that she had made contact with the beast, the repercussions would be catastrophic. Reaching the main level, she burst into a deserted corridor, gulping air like a drowning woman. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The memory of his golden eyes haunted her every blink. She did not need the officiant or the pack's traditions to tell her she had discovered her mate. The bond was undeniable, but the reality was terrifying. Her true mate was a half-mad prisoner, a beast that everyone feared and wanted to destroy if he posed too great a threat. Silas, the pack, the entire political structure around her, they would never accept this. She sank against a marble column, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. The corridors of the palace felt warped, suffocating under the weight of her impossible secret. She was meant for an alpha, but fate had given her a beast. She did not know whether to rejoice in the knowledge that her true mate was alive and near, or despair at the hopelessness of such a bond. From this point on, nothing would ever be the same. She had looked into the beast's eyes and sensed that he knew her too, on that soul-deep level only a fated mate could. She had felt recognition flow between them like an unspoken vow. Now, with the pack on high alert, with Silas expecting her compliance in their engagement, and with the beast chained in the darkest corner of the dungeons, she was caught in a maelstrom of conflicting loyalties. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the deep tones of the palace bells signaling midday, but it felt strangely irrelevant, a mere echo in a realm far removed from her tumultuous thoughts. She closed her eyes, inhaling the crisp scent of stone and incense that drifted through the hallway. "What do I do?" she whispered to the silent walls. There was no easy answer. If she told anyone the truth, chaos would ensue. If she remained silent, she risked the pack sentencing her true mate to death should his presence become too great a threat. Her mind darted in frantic circles, searching for a path forward. A singular resolve began to form in the chaos of her thoughts. She could not abandon him. She had to find a way to reach him, to break through his feral shell, to learn who he really was and how to save him. Whether it was from a curse, a twisted magic, or just the madness of prolonged captivity, she could not be sure. But if the moon goddess had entwined their fates, perhaps there was a reason behind all of this. It was a terrifying burden, but she would rather bear it than live in hollow ignorance. Wiping her tears, she slipped into a smaller side corridor leading to a secluded courtyard. She needed a moment in open air to steady herself. The courtyard was empty, except for a single willow tree drooping over a reflecting pool. She approached the water's edge, gazing at her reflection, seeing the turmoil etched across her features. The future Luna, now undone by a single meeting with the captive beast. She wondered what the rest of the pack would think if they saw her thus, trembling, eyes rimmed red with emotion, heart lost to a creature they deemed an abomination. Yet, as she stared at her reflection, she recalled the raw vulnerability in his gaze, hidden beneath the layers of rage. In that moment, she silently vowed to learn his truth, to unravel the dark secret of his past. For if she did nothing, the pack would likely destroy him or leave him to languish until he broke free in a final, catastrophic act. Part of her doubted her own courage, uncertain that she was capable of changing anything in a world dominated by powerful alphas and centuries-old traditions. But her heart insisted that, for better or worse, she was already intertwined with him. Turning her back on him now would be like ripping away a piece of her own soul. She pulled her cloak closer, letting the wind caress her cheeks as she lifted her head to the sky. High above, the sun was shrouded by a veil of clouds. Her thoughts were already racing, formulating how she might next visit him undetected, how she might coax him into calm, and whether there was a way for them to communicate. The swirling uncertainty of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she clung to that faint thread of determination. In the distance, she heard a faint clamor in the direction of the main palace building. She realized that soon she would be summoned to appear at Silas's side again, to play the part of the dutiful future Luna. She dreaded it, already feeling the burn of deception in her chest. She wasn't sure how long she could keep her secret hidden, but for now, at least, she had to try. Steeling herself, she turned back toward the palace, resolving that she would endure the facade for as long as necessary, all the while planning her next move to uncover the beast's story and perhaps find a way to redeem him. Amara walked through the corridors, her posture composed, her expression carefully schooled, even as her thoughts whirled. She had never been a creature of deception, but now she found herself on the threshold of a grand secret, one that would upend everything if discovered. She could almost sense the presence of the beast, locked below, as though an invisible tether bound them across the distance. That evening, she dined with Silas and a few ranking officials, all of whom were preoccupied with talk of strengthening the dungeon wards. She offered perfunctory remarks, quietly absorbing the severity of the measures they planned to impose. She gleaned that witches might indeed be summoned from a neighboring pack to cast new sealing spells, though the negotiations would take time. Silas, noticing her silence, reached for her hand beneath the table, giving it a comforting squeeze. She felt a stab of guilt, remembering how only hours ago she had stood at the door of another cell, feeling an inexplicable bond that eclipsed all that she shared with Silas. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, consumed by a single question that refused to relent. How could she save her mate from the cold darkness, and at the same time uphold her responsibilities to her pack? No solution seemed possible. She began to weep softly, tears sliding down her temples, soaking her pillow, her wolf stirring with equal parts longing and despair. Sleep eventually claimed her, dragging her into dreams where she once again stood beside the chained beast, her hand reaching through bars of silver, trying in vain to pull him into the light. But dawn brought no new clarity. The next day continued in much the same vein, with the palace abuzz over security concerns. Additional guards were stationed at the dungeon entrance, and rumors flew that the witches had agreed to come, though it would take them several days to arrive. Amara realized her chances to slip down there would be slimmer than ever, but she remained resolute. She waited until the hush of late evening, when most of the palace had retired. Pulling on her cloak once again, she carefully crept through the dim corridors. She had scouted the guard rotation the day before, noting a few short gaps between patrols. Though the arrangement had changed somewhat, she found a possible route. Her heart thundered as she approached the stairwell leading down. Torchlight flickered ominously, shadows dancing on the walls. She clutched the small packet of cooked meat she had managed to tuck away from the kitchen, uncertain if she could actually pass it to the beast, but wanting to try. If she could show kindness, perhaps she could coax a more human response, or at least a less violent one. Slipping downstairs, she winced at the presence of 2 guards stationed at the base. They were deep in conversation, and she could not risk sneaking by them in the open. Thinking quickly, she detoured into a nearby storage room, weaving her way through barrels and crates. A side exit from the storage room led to a lesser-known hallway, though it was rarely used because it connected to older, half-abandoned sections of the dungeons. She only knew of it because she explored it once as a curious child. The corridor was dusty and cramped, cobwebs draping from the ceiling. She coughed softly, covering her mouth with a corner of her cloak. The stones underfoot were worn and uneven, but she pressed on, guided by the faint flickers of torchlight that filtered in from the main passage. Eventually, she found an iron gate that looked half-rusted shut. She tested it, and to her relief, it groaned open just enough for her to slip through. Beyond it lay a connecting passage that angled back toward the deeper cells. The air was frigid, laced with a stale odor that reminded her of old heartbreak. Her heartbeat quickened as she navigated the darkness. Every scrape of her shoe on the stone sent echoes skittering along the corridor. If a god was nearby, she'd be discovered in an instant. She paused frequently, listening for any sign of human presence. But aside from the occasional drip of water, all remained quiet. Eventually she emerged into a small alcove that overlooked the circular chamber where she had last seen the guards enter the beast's cell. She crouched behind a stone ledge, surveying the area. As expected, guards were posted there, likely because of the heightened security. 2 of them, both armed with silver-tipped spears, stood at the main entrance to the corridor leading to the beast's cell. Amara's hope of approaching from the main route evaporated. She would never get past them. Silently cursing, she scanned the chamber for another approach. She noticed a narrow ledge that ran along the far wall, leading to a small archway partially collapsed with rubble, yet not entirely blocked. It seemed to head in the same direction as the beast's cell, possibly a different entrance or an older route. She swallowed hard, deciding it was worth a try. Keeping her body low to the ground, she inched along the perimeter of the chamber, using the shadows to stay hidden. Her heart pounded so violently she worried it might give her away. But the gods remained focused on the main entrances, conversing in hushed voices about their dread of the beast. It took several nerve-wracking minutes, but at last she reached the small archway without being detected. Stepping through the crumbled threshold, she found herself in a dim, narrow passage that smelled of damp earth. The walls were thick with moss, and her feet sank into decades of accumulated dirt. It was apparent no one had used this path for years, perhaps even centuries. Holding her breath, she followed the corridor, guided only by the faint flicker of light coming from the beast's cell. She felt her palms grow clammy around the packet of food she carried, but she pressed on. At last, she reached a small grated window set high in the wall. Through it, she glimpsed the same cell she had peered into from the door before. The angle was different, but she recognized the black-furred shape huddled against the stone floor, chains encircling him like a cruel net. Torchlight danced over his form, revealing his rigid muscles and ragged breathing. The sight sent a fresh wave of sorrow through her. She noticed that he was partially shifted, his arms and torso covered in thick patches of fur, his claws digging into the stone floor, as though the man and wolf inside him were locked in constant battle. Carefully, she tested the small grate. It was corroded by time, its metal bars brittle under her tentative push. She pressed more firmly, and with a soft snap, one of the bars gave way. She froze, worried the noise might alert him. But he remained still, his breathing uneven but otherwise unmoving. Encouraged, she shifted another bar. Eventually, she made an opening large enough to fit her arm through. her throat constricted with apprehension. She had no illusions about the risk. If he lunged and grabbed her, he could tear her arm off before she had a chance to scream. Yet she pushed aside the fear, guided by instinct. Slowly, trembling, she extracted a small piece of roasted meat from the pouch and held it through the opening. "Please," she whispered, voice barely audible, I brought you something." At first, there was no reaction, save for the subtle quiver of his powerful shoulders. Then he stiffened, lifting his head just enough for his gaze to slide across the cell. Even in the weak light, she saw the faint glow of his eyes. Her heart thudded dangerously, an internal drumbeat of excitement and dread. She wondered if he could see her silhouette through the gap, or if he only smelled her presence. He let out a low growl, but it was more uncertain than aggressive. She tried to steady her breath, channeling calm, letting her wolf sense flow toward him. "It's all right," she managed to say, as if speaking to a wounded animal. "I won't hurt you." Slowly, warily, he approached the source of her voice. His chain scraped, the collar's runes catching stray beams of light. He remained crouched, one clawed hand gripping the floor, the other dragging a length of chain. She felt like her heart might stop when he came within a few feet of the grate. Even though they were separated by metal bars, the tension in the air was suffocating. He sniffed, his wolf senses flaring, probably catching the scent of warm meat and her own distinct aroma. She offered a second piece, gently pushing it through the opening, dropping it onto the floor inside the cell. He jerked back as though startled, then crept closer to inspect it. Finally, with a low rumble, he snatched it up, devouring it in a few swift bites. Relief and emotion flooded Amara's chest. He was hungry, or at least willing to accept her offering. She drew in a shaky breath, retrieving another piece from the pouch. This time, she set it on the grate's edge, allowing him to see it more clearly. He edged forward, his golden eyes flicking between her and the morsel. She didn't dare move. At last, he reached out, long claws wrapping around the meat. She caught a glimpse of his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the thick stubble or fur covering his cheeks. A deep scar curved along one side of his neck, near the collar, and a fresh burn from the silver glowed an angry red. Her eyes misted with tears of sympathy. She murmured softly, "I'm so sorry for the pain you've endured." He gave a small growl in return, but it lacked its previous hostility, almost as if he recognized her remorse. Encouraged, she mustered the courage to speak again. "I don't know if you can understand me, or if you remember how to speak, but I want to help you. Somehow." He tilted his head, a faint flicker of curiosity or confusion in his gaze. She wondered if he could sense the mate bond as clearly as she did, if it was overshadowed by his rage and pain. Perhaps it flickered in him, a faint echo of what once might have been a normal life. For a minute, they remained in that tense standoff, connected by a crumbling grate and a half-lit cell. She wanted so desperately to ask him his name, to hear him speak it. She nearly whispered, "Who are you?" But the words caught in her throat. She was afraid to push too hard, to break this fragile trust. Instead, she offered one last piece of meat. He devoured it swiftly, then stared at her, chest heaving. A sorrowful calm filled the space. She felt her wolf urging her to comfort him, to erase the agony etched across every inch of his body. But she knew that was impossible tonight. The faint echo of voices from the corridor warned her that guards might wander this way again. She had to leave before they realized she was gone. With a trembling hand, she brushed the tears from her cheeks. "I'll come back," she promised in a whisper. "I won't abandon you." He let out a sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Then the moment ended. She backed away, careful not to make sudden noise, and slipped down the passage until she reached the battered iron gate. Once more, she found herself navigating the dark labyrinth of the old dungeon corridors, her heart a mixture of sorrow and fierce determination. When she finally emerged onto the main level, her emotions overwhelmed her, and she sank against a wall, letting out a shaky exhale. She felt the bond thrumming, the surety that she had glimpsed him not as a monster, but as a tortured soul in dire need of salvation. Her tears came unbidden, but not from fear. They came from a strange mixture of relief, longing, and the crushing weight of what lay ahead. She did not know how she would free him, or if it was even possible without unleashing catastrophic danger. She had no plan yet on how to handle Silas, or the council, or the entire pack that would oppose such madness. But she no longer questioned whether the beast was truly her mate. She felt it in her bones, in the primal beat of her wolf's heart. The question now was whether that bond would be strong enough to overcome the darkness that had consumed him for so long, and whether, when all was revealed, her pack would brand her a traitor for loving a man they called a monster. Yet even in the swirling storm of dread and uncertainty, she sensed that her path was set. Fate had chosen them, and she would not shirk that calling. Deep beneath the palace, a cursed werewolf waited, his golden eyes ablaze with a spark of recognition. One day, the cage doors would open, and he would come for her. She only hoped that by then she would have found a way to ensure that their union would not tear the entire pack apart. Night wrapped the palace in a blanket of shadows, the moon slung low and bright over ramparts that rose like silent sentinels against the sky. Beyond the palace walls, the forest stretched into the distance, a tapestry of dark pine and swaying birch. Inside those walls, the tension was almost tangible, an invisible thread binding every wolf, every guard, every occupant in a web of fear and secrecy. For the first time in years, the entire Silvercrest Pack had been reminded of the beast locked beneath the palace, of the power trembling at the edges of its iron cage. That quake, which had rattled the engagement ceremony and shaken the illusions of safety, loomed large in everyone's mind. Amara had spent the last few nights in a state of restless torment, plagued by nightmares of golden eyes staring at her from the darkness, by half-formed dreams of silver chains and a creature whose rage echoed through her very bones. By day, she went about her obligations with the grace expected of a future Luna, walking at Silas's side, greeting visiting dignitaries, accepting their measured congratulations on her impending union. But beneath the veneer, her heart pounded to a different rhythm. It beat for that caged werewolf, the one whose agony she had witnessed up close, whose low growls and wounded snarls had carved themselves into her soul. She no longer needed rumors to know the truth. His existence was no myth, no distant legend conjured to frighten pups. She had seen him, fed him, spoken words of comfort through bars etched with runic wards. She had watched as he devoured the morsels she offered, his entire body trembling with pent-up fury and hunger. And in those fleeting moments, she had felt the bond between them, an electric current snapping through her nerves, insisting that this beast was more than a stranger, more than a savage. He was her mate. The knowledge had left her shaken, torn between loyalty to her pack and the primal call of the mate bond a force revered in werewolf tradition. She believed in the power of the moon goddess, had grown up listening to elders tell stories of how the goddess paired wolves destined to share life's burdens and joys. Never, not once, had she imagined that her own mate could be someone so feared that he was kept in chains deep underground. Yet the truth blazed within her, undeniable and fierce. That morning, as the sun's first golden rays crept through her window, she rose with determination. She had decided she would not resign herself to silence any longer. If she was indeed the beast's mate, she needed answers, needed to know how he had come to be caged in Silvercrest dungeons. Her earlier covert visits had revealed a partial truth, but not the entire story. She was certain that Beta Cororin, who seemed uneasy yet sympathetic, or even some of the older guards might hold fragments of the tale. Perhaps even Silas's father, the current alpha, understood more about the beast's origins than he let on. Silas himself, though he was to be her future mate in name, had shown no inclination to confide deeper truths. Whenever the subject of the quake or the dungeon was broached, he veered the conversation away, feigning that it was a matter for the senior council. Silas was not cruel. He did seem genuinely concerned for her well-being, but he was pragmatic to the point of denying anything he deemed too complicated. Their partnership, she realized, was a polished shield for political convenience, lacking the fiery spark she had always thought a mate bond should ignite. Mid-morning found her pacing one of the palace's smaller courtyards, where a modest fountain bubbled gently, and the early autumn sun cast dappled light across the marble tiles. Patches of red and gold leaves lay scattered around the edges, a promise that winter would come soon. She wore a pale lavender gown that fluttered around her ankles, its sleeves trimmed with delicate lace. Her hair was pulled back from her face, but a few rebellious strands teased her cheeks each time the breeze stirred. Beta Cororin, that silver-haired sentinel of the palace, approached quietly from an archway. He carried a handful of scrolls and wore a deep frown. Despite the tension in his bearing, he nodded respectfully when he drew near. "My lady, you asked to speak with me?" he said, his tone cordial but guarded. They had shared a clandestine exchange before regarding the beast, but had not convened in private since. Amara paused in her pacing, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yes. Thank you for meeting me, Beta Cororin. I find I have questions that I can't seem to quell. I was hoping you could enlighten me, or at least guide me in the right direction." He glanced around to ensure they were alone. The trickle of water from the fountain covered the worst of their murmurs, but it was wise to be cautious. "Ask what you wish, my lady, and I'll do my best to answer. The subject is—" He paused, letting the last word hang unspoken because of the risk. "Complicated?" She stepped closer, her voice quivering with the earnest need for truth. "Why was he brought here? I know he's from some distant pack, that he was cursed or lost his mind. But how did the old alpha come to possess him? Has anyone tried to help him, to see if the madness can be reversed? It all feels so wrong, keeping him down there like a rabid animal with no chance of release." Cororin sighed, running a hand through his hair. He stared at the scrolls he carried as though they might hold the answers. "I only know pieces, my lady. The story goes that the old alpha owed a great debt to a traveling party from Thornridge, a pack that was once powerful, but somehow fell into turmoil. They brought this werewolf, already half broken, chained with silver shackles, in exchange for certain favors or alliances. The old alpha agreed to keep him locked away. No one spoke openly of what he had done. Some say he was an alpha who committed unspeakable acts. Others claim he angered the moon goddess. In the end, It was decided that any risk of setting him loose outweighed any mercy. Amara felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Thornridge. She'd heard that name only in the quiet hush of the library, in references to a warlike pack that had collapsed decades prior. "So he's been there ever since," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. She could see it so vividly, a proud wolf, betrayed, chained like a bargaining chip in an underworld of politics and cruelty. "Have you ever seen him calm, docile, or anything suggesting there's a mind underneath all that rage?" Cororin hesitated, guilt flickering in his eyes. "He's always been violent when approached, or so the guards say. He's half feral, but I can't deny there are rumors that on rare occasions he seems lucid, as though he's trying to speak or remember. The witches came once, many years ago, at the behest of the old Alpha to reinforce the runic wards on his collar. They left muttering that he was a lost cause, that no conventional magic could quell the beast unless the goddess herself intervened." A wave of longing and sorrow washed over her. She recalled the look in those golden eyes when she'd passed him a piece of meat through the grate, a hint of confusion and gratitude. Yes, he was dangerous. Anyone locked in torment for so long would be. But the glimpses of intelligence, the subtle hum of connection, had left no doubt that he was more than mindless rage. And if the bond they shared truly was from the goddess, maybe she was the very key to unlocking his humanity. Beta Cororin cleared his throat, glancing around nervously. "I must warn you, my lady, it's best not to meddle. If Alpha Kaelan or Silas suspect you've grown too interested, they'll clamp down. These are precarious times. Tensions run high after that quake shook the palace, and the witches who once did the wards, they've been called again. They'll arrive any day to fortify the spells. Some fear that if he isn't contained, he could one day break free and wreak havoc." Her heart clenched. The image of witches layering even more agony onto the werewolf's existence made her want to weep or rage. "Thank you, Cororin," she managed, voice thick. "I appreciate your candor." She lowered her gaze. "I only wish there was more I could do." He inclined his head, sadness etched into the lines of his face. "I've seen you grow up, my lady, and I know your compassion. Take care. Compassion can be seen as weakness in these halls, especially where that creature is concerned." With a final bow, he excused himself, leaving her alone with her turbulent thoughts. She sank onto the fountain's edge, trailing her fingers in the cool water. If the witches were returning soon, that meant they might do irreversible damage, delving deeper into curses, or attempting to extract what little remained of his mind. She shuddered, recalling her first close look at him, chained, scars lacing his body, collar searing his neck. The guilt of her inaction gnawed at her. If he was indeed her mate, she owed it to them both to act, to fight for him, rather than letting the pack's fear decide his fate. But how? She could not simply ask Silas to release him. She could not waltz into the dungeons, unlock his chains, and walk out to freedom. The entire palace bristled with guards. The witches, upon arrival, would no doubt intensify that vigilance. Even if she freed him, a half-feral werewolf might be as great a danger to her as to anyone else. Yet her wolf instincts insisted he would never harm her, that a mate's presence might calm him. She felt drawn to him in ways she'd never experienced, as though an invisible tether linked them. For the rest of that day, she drifted through the palace like a ghost, giving polite nods to staff, attending brief meetings with Silas, and feigning interest in planning sessions for the official wedding ceremony. But inside, her determination crystallized. If the old texts were right, if a mate could soothe or even undo the madness inflicted by curses, then she had to try. She had to strengthen their bond in some tangible way before the witches re-enslaved him with more runes. When twilight arrived, she penned a note to Lydia, her most trusted maid, instructing that she would retire early with a headache. Slipping out of her chambers by a side door, she donned a simple cloak and soft boots. She threaded her way down the lesser-used corridors with every sense on high alert. Since discovering that hidden passage which led to the grated window of his cell, she had mapped out a route that minimized the risk of crossing guard patrols. Though the pack was more vigilant than ever, there remained small cracks in the fortress's routine if one was determined enough. Her heart thrummed with adrenaline as she reached the stairwell. Tonight, she dared not bring open flame, for a torch or lantern would only draw unwanted attention. The dungeons were cold and shadowed, but she trusted her wolf senses to guide her steps. Her breathing was shallow, the memory of her last visit flooding her mind, his tremors of rage, the heartbreak in his eyes. She pressed forward. The dungeons were quieter than usual. Perhaps the guard rotations had changed to accommodate the impending arrival of the witches, or maybe more manpower was stationed near the main entrance. Either way, she was grateful. Only a pair of guards lingered near the standard entrance. She slipped past them, hugging the walls until she reached a narrow corridor that angled sharply downward. At last, she found the rusty iron grate she'd pushed open before. She squeezed through, heart hammering. Minutes later, she arrived at the small window that overlooked his cell. The runes and bars glowed faintly, emanating residual enchantment. The corridor flickered with torchlight from some distant sconce, enough to let her glimpse the cell's interior. The shape of him hunched in the corner was instantly recognizable. Broad shoulders, thick arms, chains coiled around him like a cruel tapestry of iron. She swallowed hard, inching closer until she could peer through the bars. He didn't roar this time. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, his hair a tangled curtain around his face. She saw the faint gleam of those golden eyes. Her pulse leapt when their gazes locked. Even from that distance, the bond hummed, a gentle but insistent call that neither of them could ignore. She placed her palm against the grate. "I came back," she whispered, her voice catching. "I had to make sure you were, well, I know you're not fine, but I had to see you." The silence was thick, punctuated by the drip of water from somewhere in the dungeon's depths. He shifted, chains scraping. A low growl resonated in his throat, but it was not the unbridled fury of before. It sounded more like a wounded animal acknowledging a familiar presence. She dared to hope that the morsels of food, the whispered words, had begun to soften his hostility. Carefully, she maneuvered her cloak until she pulled out a small cloth sack. She had stolen slices of roasted meat from the kitchens, still warm when she left her chambers. It had cooled in the dungeon's chill air, but it was better fare than whatever slop the guards provided. If they were feeding him at all. She pushed the sack through a narrow gap in the grated window, praying he would take it as he had before. His nostrils flared, catching the scent. Slowly, he hauled himself closer, each movement stiff and agonized, the silver collar glinting. A tremor rippled through him, as though even that minimal shift tested his battered body. Reaching a clawed hand, he snatched the sack, retreating to the corner with a low grunt. She watched as he tore into the meat, devouring it like a starved creature. Emotions swelled in her chest, a painful mix of sorrow and tenderness. She waited until he was finished. "They say the witches are coming again," she murmured, her voice echoing softly through the bars. "They'll try new spells, reinforce the runes. I'm frightened for you." A rough, rasping sound emerged from his throat, almost like an attempt at speech. She leaned closer, bracing her forearms on the ledge. "Can you speak? Do you remember your name?" Her eyes stung with tears. She longed for any scrap of clarity that might ease his suffering. He coughed, the effort making his body shudder. At last he let out a sound that could have been a word, but it was guttural, half lost. He closed his eyes, tipping his head back in frustration. The chain along his neck rattled. Amara felt her tears spill over. "I'm sorry," she said thickly. "I can't help you if I don't," she broke off, emotions tangling her words. "But maybe the goddess can. Maybe there's a way to break the curse, to free you. I want to try." His gaze flicked to her, confusion and longing swirling in its depths. She swallowed, remembering the old texts referencing a mate's ability to anchor a lost wolf. The question was how. She had no magical powers, no training to dismantle curses, but the mate bond itself might be a conduit. If she could somehow strengthen that connection, if he could trust her enough to let the bond in, perhaps his mind could begin to mend. Steeling her nerves, she slowly placed her hand through the bars, extending it into his cell. Her heart bumped so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She had attempted a similar gesture once before, and he had recoiled, frightened by the surge of energy between them. But she sensed that if they were to have any chance of saving him, they needed more than occasional scraps of food and whispered words. They needed the raw, unfiltered contact that declared them mates. He stared at her outstretched arm, and for a tense moment, she feared he would growl, maybe lunge. But instead, he inched forward with wary slowness, the chain scraping across the floor. His free hand, scarred and calloused, reached out. His fingers brushed hers, and the instant they made contact, a spark of warmth ignited. It shot up her arm, tingling through her body. She gasped softly. This was no ordinary sensation. It was as though her wolf spirit recognized him, urging her not to withdraw. He jerked slightly, a growl rumbling in his chest. She forced herself to stay steady, not to pull away in fear. "It's all right," she whispered. "I won't hurt you." She let her fingers curl around his, feeling the roughness of his skin, the tremor in his palm. The chain at his neck sizzled faintly, but no illusions shattered this time. He remained there, panting softly, staring at their joined hands. And then it happened. A faint glow shimmered, so subtle she might have believed it a trick of torchlight, if not for the unmistakable surge in her chest. She felt an echo from him, like a hesitant pulse that matched her own. His golden eyes widened, flicking up to meet her gaze. For that fleeting second, she saw a flicker of raw emotion in them, not anger or hostility, but something far more vulnerable. "Who are you?" he rasped, the words dragging from his throat, as though it were a half-remembered incantation. Her breath hitched. He had spoken actual words, however strained. A wave of relief and compassion slammed into her so strongly she had to blink back tears. "I'm Amara," she said softly, voice cracking. "I belong to the Silvercrest Pack, but—" She broke off, heart pounding. "No, not but. We're mates. Fate, I don't know how else to say it, but I feel it. Do you feel it too?" He did not answer, but his hand tensed around hers, and another low rumble sounded in his chest. His gaze burned into her like molten gold. He might not have full clarity, but recognition dawned in his eyes, a primal certainty that echoed her claim. Before she could speak further, heavy footfalls echoed in the corridor behind her, accompanied by the clatter of armor. She stiffened, yanking her hand away. The warmth that had coursed through her veins fizzled out, replaced by cold dread. If guards found her in this forbidden cell, it could spell disaster, not just for her, but for him. With a final agonized glance, she mouthed the words, "I'll come back," then scrambled away, navigating the darkness with frantic haste. Every nerve thrummed with the terror of discovery and the heartbreak of leaving him so abruptly. She fled down the cramped passage, up the twisting stairs, and into the quiet hallway above. She pressed herself flat against a wall, panting, until the guard patrol passed. When she was certain no one was following, she slid into a storage alcove, clutching her chest. Tears streaked her cheeks. He had spoken, had asked who she was. The miracle of that moment lifted her spirits even as dread for the future weighed her down. She tasted blood where she had bitten her lip. The witches would arrive soon, and if they succeeded in subduing him completely, he might never again find his voice or his sanity. Yet a fresh spark of hope ignited in her heart. If that single touch, that fleeting moment of physical contact, had bridged the gap between his mind and hers, perhaps more was possible. She could not give up on him. She would not. The silent vow echoed in her mind, fierce and unyielding. She would do whatever it took to set him free, to let him claim the life robbed from him by curses and cruelty. Little did she know that vow would soon force her to decide how far she would go against her own pack, how many laws she would break, and whose trust she would shatter. For in forging that connection, in claiming him as her rightful mate, she had already set in motion the final unraveling of the old order. Destiny, it seemed, would not allow them to remain in the shadows for long. For 2 tense days, the palace buzzed with the impending arrival of the witches. Whispers hissed among the corridors, speculation ran rampant, and the older warriors who remembered the last time these robed enchantresses had come were tight-lipped with apprehension. Amara moved like a ghost through the public spaces, her composure carefully fixed, even as her thoughts churned with 1,000 fears. Would she have time to see him again? To anchor him more firmly to his own humanity? Or would she be forced to watch from a distance as the witches unleashed fresh torment? When they arrived, it was in the dead of night, heralded by the rumble of a storm that tore across the sky. Heavy rain hammered the palace roofs, and thunder reverberated in the courtyard as 2 robed figures dismounted their horses, escorted by a sizable guard detail. Lightning flashed, illuminating their silhouettes beneath the grand archway. One was a tall woman with iron-gray hair pulled tight, lines of age etched into her pale face, her eyes cold and calculating. The other was younger, her dark curls dripping rain, a wary expression on her angular features. Both carried satchels rumored to contain all manner of runic ingredients, silver dust, vials of strange liquids, pungent herbs. Amara watched from an upper window, her heart pounding like a drumbeat of dread. She remembered Beta Cororin's warning. These witches had come before, weaving spells that laced the beast's collar with runic wards. Now they would do so again, perhaps more viciously, more thoroughly. She could almost sense the panic emanating from him, even though thick layers of stone and distance separated them. At dawn, they descended into the dungeons with Silas, the Alpha, and a squad of armed warriors. The older witch, called Seraphine, carried a staff carved with odd symbols that glinted in the torchlight. The younger, named Eliana, bore a set of silver shackles and a sheaf of scrolls. Rumor had it they intended not just to reinforce the existing wards, but to experiment with extracting the beast's aura of rage, hoping to weaken him. The entire palace braced for the possibility of another quake or outbreak of violence. Amara, naturally, was forbidden from attending. Silas made that clear, insisting it was dangerous and unnecessary for her to be present. She listened to his clipped explanation with clenched fists, feigning polite obedience. Meanwhile, her soul raged. She imagined the monstrous ring of guards, the witches chanting incantations, the heavy swirl of wolfsbane smoke that would burn his nostrils. She saw him writhing in agony, forced to shift against his will, the silver collar searing new wounds into his flesh. The image was unbearable. She was pacing her chambers when the quake struck, mid-afternoon, a violent tremor that rattled the floor beneath her feet. The windows clattered, and her vanity mirror nearly toppled. Distant screams sounded, and outside, a swirl of frantic movement erupted in the courtyard. The quake did not last as long as the first, but it was enough to jolt every occupant with panic. Amara's heart lurched. The beast was fighting back. Despite runes and curses, he was resisting with all the strength he had. Yet the witches were prepared this time, and she feared his defiance would only lead to harsher punishments. Unable to endure the uncertainty, she slept out. She was no guard or council member, but no one was paying attention in the chaos. Making her way along the corridors leading down to the dungeons, she encountered countless panicked faces. Guards rushed around, some carrying extra chains, others brandishing weapons, while staff darted aside, eyes wide with fear. In the subterranean passages, the air stank of wolfsbane and scorched stone. Torchlight flickered ominously, and the faint echoes of chanting seeped through the walls. At last she reached the corridor outside his cell. Armed warriors clogged the entrance, while Seraphine's voice rang out, commanding them to hold positions. From behind them, a muffled roar reverberated, so full of pain and rage that it made Amara's skin prickle. Her breath caught. She could not see him, but she could feel him, her wolf spirit responding to the tortured cry of its mate. Without thinking, she pushed forward, ignoring the guards who tried to block her path. "Stop!" one guard barked, grabbing her arm. She yanked free, eyes blazing with a fierce determination that startled him. Another warrior moved to intercept, but before he could, Silas appeared, stepping out from the cell's threshold. He was breathing hard, his normally composed features twisted in alarm. "Amara," he snapped, "you shouldn't be here. This is dangerous. Go back upstairs." She set her jaw, her heartbeat thunderous. "You're torturing him," she accused, voice raw. "You call me your future mate, yet you won't let me see what's really happening? Let me through." Silas's eyes flickered with anger and something akin to guilt. "This is not your concern. You have no idea what's at stake. The witches are trying to subdue him before he brings the palace down on our heads." "Then let me help," she insisted, tears burning in her eyes. She knew it was madness, but she couldn't stay away. "Let me talk to him, calm him. Lock me in there if you must, but please." A thunderous crash echoed from inside the cell, followed by shrieks. One guard stumbled out, blood on his armor. More chanting flared, and flickers of eerie light danced across the stone walls. Silas cursed under his breath, ordering the guards to reinforce the door. For a moment he seemed torn, glancing at her with wild uncertainty. She thought she saw the faint outline of regret in his features, but he shook his head. "No, you can't be in the middle of this." Motioning to a pair of warriors, he said, "Escort her away, now." Amara struggled as the warriors grabbed her arms, dragging her back up the corridor. She tried to wrench free, but they were stronger. "Silas!" she shouted, voice cracking. "If you do this, you'll regret it." But he was gone, disappearing back into the cell, consumed by the chaos. Her own cries echoed uselessly. The guards hauled her to a side passage, releasing her once she stopped struggling. She could do nothing but stand there, trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. The faint roars and chanting continued, each one a stab to her heart. That quake had proven the beast's power, but it also foretold the witch's retaliation. By the time they finished, he might be left broken, sedated, or pressed under new wards that ensured he would never see the light of day again. The thought ignited a fierce rebellion inside her. She stormed back to her chambers, ignoring the stares of passers-by. Lydia, her maid, hovered anxiously at the door, eyes wide with concern, but Amara brushed her off with a curt nod. She collapsed onto the bed, swallowing thick sobs, her mind racing. She wanted to tear open the dungeon door and free him, but how could she face down witches and an entire contingent of warriors alone? Evening came, and with it, ominous quiet. News circulated that the beast had been subdued. The witches were finishing their spells, adding fresh layers of runes to the collar, the walls, even to the silver manacles he wore. A hush of grim triumph settled over the palace. Yet that hush felt more like a funeral pall to Amara, as if they had buried him alive. She learned through hushed servant gossip that the witches planned a grand final ritual late that night, one meant to drain the dark energies from him, to sever the wild fury that fueled his strength. Many believed it would quell him once and for all, leaving behind a husk of a wolf, docile or perhaps catatonic. An icy dread gripped her heart. He had spoken to her, had shown lucid awareness in that dim cell, had begun to reclaim fragments of himself. Now, all that progress might be erased in a single night. She couldn't let it happen. She was his mate, the one the moon goddess had chosen for him, no matter how improbable the pairing might seem. If a fated mate's presence could unravel curses, then perhaps the final ceremony, this dreadful draining ritual, could be disrupted by that same bond. But how to get close enough? And what then? She had no plan, only desperation. Yet desperation, she realized, was the only lifeline left. Near midnight, she slipped from her chambers, again wearing a plain cloak and carrying no lantern. She moved quickly, relying on the same back corridors she had used before. The storm had tapered off, leaving behind puddles in the courtyard and a lingering chill in the air. Guards patrolled with heightened vigilance, so she ducked behind columns and inched through shadowed alcoves. Finally, she reached the same abandoned passage that led to the grated window. The moment she pried the rusty grate aside, an acrid scent assaulted her, wolfsbane, thick and pungent. Her eyes watered. The witches must be burning it in large quantities. Crouching low, she crept down the corridor until the flicker of torchlight and the thrum of chanting reached her ears. The chanting was eerie, a relentless drone that set her teeth on edge. She came upon the grated window and peered inside. The cell was awash in trembling light from multiple torches set in brackets. The witches, robed in black, stood around the beast's chained form, their arms raised in rhythmic incantation. He knelt on the cold floor, silver manacles anchoring his wrists and ankles, the collar crackling with threads of purple-white magic. A circle of runes had been drawn on the stone around him. The smell of wolfsbane smoke was everywhere. Guards lined the walls, alert and tense. Silas stood near the entrance, sword at his side. His jaw was clenched, the lines of his face etched with conflicted resolve. Beta Cororin hovered at a distance, arms crossed tightly, his gaze flicking in uncertainty between the beast and the witches. And there, in the center of that hellish scene, The man she knew was her mate, trembled on his hands and knees, suppressed by curse upon curse. Amara's heart twisted. His body bore new burns and cuts, fresh rivulets of blood staining the floor. Yet despite the agony, she sensed his defiance. His claws dug into the stone, muscles taut. He let out a ragged snarl, and the witches recoiled. Seraphine scowled, chanting faster, swinging a censer that spewed wolfsbane vapor. Eliana placed her palm on the collar, muttering words that caused the runes to flare brighter. A strangled roar escaped his throat, filled with both wrath and despair. Torchlight danced across his features, revealing eyes that blazed gold. Amara could almost feel his silent plea, the yearning for someone to save him from this nightmare. And in that instant, she decided she could not wait any longer. She had to intervene. Swallowing her terror, she pressed both hands to the grated window, ignoring the stinging runes. She closed her eyes and summoned every ounce of will. If a mate's bond had the power to disrupt curses, then maybe she could call to him, guide his spirit away from the witch's grip. It was a wild, desperate gamble, but it was all she had. "Listen to me," she shouted, voice resonating in the small corridor. Her cry echoed into the cell, causing some guards to turn in surprise. She saw Silas's head whip around, scanning for the source of the voice. Seraphine faltered in her chant. Eliana cursed under her breath. The beast, kneeling in the center, gave a jolt, as though he recognized her call. "Look at me!" Amara screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She could barely see through the grated window, but she envisioned him, imagined their bond, like a glowing thread that stretched between them. "Break free! You are not a monster. You are more than their curses. I'm here. You are my mate, and you are not alone." The chanting wavered, disrupted by her words. A ripple of energy pulsed from him, colliding with the witch's runic barrier. She felt the burn on her palms intensify, but she pushed harder, ignoring the pain. Gods shouted, some scrambling to see who was shouting. Through the bedlam, she caught a glimpse of Silas, shock etched on his face, perhaps realizing that the voice was hers. "Fight it!" she yelled, voice tearing at her throat. "Remember who you are." "I won't lose you!" Suddenly, the cell erupted in chaos. The beast roared, wrenching against the chains with a force that made the entire chamber reverberate. The runes on his collar sparked violently. A swirl of dark energy and glowing arcs battered the walls, knocking some guards off their feet. Seraphine screamed an incantation, but the swirling magic spun out of her control, feeding on the raw power unleashed by the werewolf's fury. The chain on his left wrist snapped free from its anchor, the metal ring flying across the cell in a shower of sparks. Eliana lunged, thrusting her staff forward, sending a blast of purple lightning. He staggered but did not fall, his eyes blazing. Another quake seemed to shake the dungeon, dislodging dust from the ceiling. Silas shouted, ordering the guards to hold their ground, but many scrambled back, fear etched in their faces. Amara's pulse thundered. She felt her bond with him surge, like a living flame devouring the runes that sought to cage him. "Yes," she whispered fiercely. "Come to me. Break those chains." Then, with a roar that shook her soul, he tore the collar from his neck, ignoring the silver sizzling his flesh. A blinding flash of light exploded in the cell, forcing her to shield her eyes. When she blinked the spots away, she saw him standing, unsteadily but free, the shattered collar in his hand. The witches staggered backward, horror plain on their faces. Some guards gaped, uncertain whether to charge or flee. Time seemed to slow. In the hush after that burst of energy, she could hear his ragged breathing. The half-shifted form he wore looked monstrous, dark fur streaked with blood, massive claws, eyes like molten gold. Yet she saw his chest rise and fall with deliberate control, as though fighting to remain lucid. He dropped the broken collar, the clank echoing ominously. Seraphine recovered her voice, shrieking, "End him now!" before, but she never finished. With a guttural snarl, he sprang at her, slamming her against the wall. Her staff clattered away. Eliana shrieked, raising her arms to cast another spell, but a swift backhand from his claws sent her tumbling. The guards, spurred to action, rushed in with silver blades. Silas stepped forward, sword drawn, shouting for them to strike. Amara's heart seized. If they cornered him in that cell, he might kill them all, or be killed himself. She couldn't wait behind the grate. Bursting into motion, she whirled and raced down the corridor, searching for any unguarded entrance. Chaos reigned, so perhaps the watch might be thinner in the adjacent passage. She sprinted, fueled by adrenaline, ignoring the burn in her lungs and the trembling of her limbs. Rounding a corner, she came upon a guard fumbling with a ring of keys. He had apparently rushed from the armory to help. Startled by her appearance, he brandished his sword, but she ducked, grabbing a loose chain from a hook on the wall. Swinging it wildly, she struck his arm and knocked the keys free. He cursed, lunging at her, but she kicked his knee, causing him to stagger. Desperate strength filled her as she grabbed the keys off the ground and darted away. She might have apologized under normal circumstances, but her mind blazed with only one purpose: getting to her mate. She found a back door leading into the central cell block, the one usually reserved for solitary confinement. It was locked, but the second key on the ring opened it with a heavy click. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she crept through, following the roars, shouts, and clashing steel. Soon, she emerged into the main dungeon corridor, seeing glimpses of battered guards, scattered torches, and swirling dust. The beast, her mate, towered at the far end, fending off multiple warriors with savage sweeps of his claws. Eliana, pinned by fear and a broken wrist, scooted away from him. Seraphine lay crumpled near the wall, unmoving, either unconscious or dead. Amara forced her way through the fray, ducking a panicked guard who swung his sword in a wild arc. She recognized Beta Cororin, who stood to one side, uncertain whether to intervene. Upon seeing her, his eyes widened in alarm. "Amara! You! This is madness!" She ignored him, weaving around a pillar, her heart hammering. Silas was there too, engaged in a desperate struggle with the beast. The future Alpha's sword slashed at her mate's flank, drawing blood, and the beast howled. In that moment, everything inside her rebelled. She sprinted forward, shouting, "No!" Her voice broke with raw emotion. She couldn't watch them kill each other, not after coming this far. She flung herself between them just as Silas raised his sword again. The beast halted, claws mid-strike, his face twisting in terror at the thought of harming her. Silas froze, sword poised. In the flickering torchlight, his expression was a mask of rage and heartbreak. "Amara, move aside," he roared, sweat dripping down his brow. "He'll kill us all." She stood firm, arms spread, keeping them apart with her body. "No, he won't," she cried. "I won't let him be a prisoner anymore, Silas. He's my mate." The words rang out, echoing over the pandemonium, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. One guard gasped, another uttered a curse. Silas's eyes blazed with disbelief and wounded pride. "That's impossible," he whispered, voice taut. "You were meant to be my Luna. I am the future Alpha." Amara's cheeks glistened with tears, her heart breaking for him as well as for herself. "You and I were never true mates," she said softly, the truth tasting both bitter and liberating. "He and I share the bond the goddess ordained, not some political union." She took a trembling breath. "I'm sorry." Behind her, the beast stood panting, half shifted, blood seeping from his wounds. His eyes flicked between her and Silas, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It was a warning. Any move to harm her, and he would fight. But with each breath, she sensed the savage edges receding, replaced by a determination to protect her. For a long moment, Silas said nothing, then the fury in his eyes burned hotter. "Traitor," he spat, voice cracking. "You choose that monster over your pack? Over me?" She bowed her head, tears falling freely. "I choose my true mate," she whispered. "And he's no monster. He was made into one by the cruelty he endured. Let us go, Silas. Please, don't force more bloodshed." He hesitated, sword trembling in his hand, as though uncertain whether to thrust forward or cast it aside. The entire dungeon seemed to hold its breath. At last, he lowered his sword, a strangled sound escaping him. "Go, then," he growled. "But don't ever return. You are no longer one of us." A sob tore from Amara's throat, but relief also flooded her. She nodded, stepping backward toward her mate, who reached out an unsteady arm. The moment she touched him, the bond surged, fierce and comforting. Around them, guards parted, either too stunned or too drained to stop them. Some stared in silent horror, others in grudging awe. Beta Cororin, tears in his own eyes, stepped aside without a word, allowing them to pass. They moved slowly, the beast limping from his wounds, his half-shifted form trembling with pain. Yet he kept his head high, golden eyes keenly aware, watchful for any last attempt to restrain them. Amara guided him up the winding corridor, using the stolen keyring to unlock gates that would have otherwise trapped them. The entire palace seemed in disarray. In the courtyard above, guards rushed about in confusion, but nobody tried to stop them. Perhaps Silas had commanded them not to, or maybe they were too rattled to face the monstrous figure emerging from the depths with the future Luna at his side. Cold night air hit them as they stumbled past the gate. The moon hung in a cloudy sky, offering a faint silver glow. She heard shouts echoing behind, but no pursuit formed. The beast let out a ragged breath, collapsing briefly to one knee. She dropped beside him, cradling his head, smoothing back the sweat-drenched hair from his brow. "Stay with me," she pleaded, voice trembling. "We're almost free." He looked at her through weary golden eyes. "Amara," he rasped, the name thick on his tongue. It was the first time he had spoken it. Her heart nearly stopped. She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, her own voice breaking. "We'll get out of here, I promise. Then we'll find a way to heal you, to remember who you are." A flicker of resolve passed through his eyes. He forced himself upright, leaning heavily on her. Together, they limped away from the only home she had ever known, from the prison that had caged him for so many years. The forest loomed beyond the palace walls, dark and silent. They plunged into its shadows, guided by the faint paths that wove among towering pines. Behind them, the palace bells told a frantic alarm, indicating a breach or emergency. But the night swallowed the sound as they trekked deeper into the trees. Every step was agony for him, each breath a ragged gasp. Amara clung to him, scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit, bracing for the possibility that Silas might change his mind and send warriors after them. But no one appeared. They were alone, fugitives in the night, yet bound by fate's unshakable tether. Hours later, when the moon neared its zenith, they found a small clearing by a stream. He collapsed to his knees, racked by pain. Amara knelt beside him, her cloak drenched in sweat and tears, her hair tangled around her face. She pressed a shaky hand to his wounds, wincing at how deep some of them ran. The silver had cut him, and the witch's runes might still fester, but the color was gone, and with it, much of the black magic that had enslaved him. She felt it as a subtle shift in the air around him, as if the weight of centuries-old curses had lifted. He rolled onto his back, breathing hard, gazing at the moon above. His eyes were still an unnatural gold, but calmer now, more focused. She carefully cradled his head in her lap, tears dribbling down her cheeks. "We're free," she whispered, though the reality of what came next loomed large. They had no pack, no resources, only each other. Still, in that moment, none of it mattered. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her, defying every chain and vow that threatened to keep them apart. The mate bond pulsed between them, weaving a sense of belonging so powerful that it eclipsed fear. She bent down and pressed her lips to his forehead, a silent pledge that she would remain by his side, that she would help him find himself, his real self, beyond the label of beast. His voice, faint but determined, broke the hush. "Name is Kaelan," he said, wincing at the effort. "I was an alpha once." The confession came out halting, yet it flowed with a quiet dignity. She realized this was the first piece of real information he had recovered about himself, a spark of identity shining through the shadows. Amara stroked his cheek, a fresh wave of tears threatening. "Kaelan," she repeated, savoring the syllables. "You're mine, Kaelan, and I'm yours. We'll unravel it all, together." A faint smile tugged at his lips, the fierceness in his gaze softening as he gazed at her. Then, overcome by exhaustion and pain, he allowed his eyes to close. She bent over him protectively, listening to the sounds of the forest, the gentle rush of the stream nearby. He needed medical attention, or at least healing herbs. She recalled some rudimentary treatments for silver burns that the palace medics had taught her. They would be traveling in uncharted territory, guided only by the bond that had brought them to this fateful moment. Yet she felt no regret, only gratitude that fate had finally intervened, shattering her false engagement and unleashing her true destiny. Yes, they were fugitives, but they were also free, with the entire world stretching out before them. She let the hush of moonlit darkness wash over her, pressing her palm to Kaelan's chest. Beneath the matted fur, she felt his heartbeat, strong and steady despite the trauma. A fierce protectiveness surged in her, a vow to stand with him, even if it meant standing against the entire Silvercrest Pack. Slowly, gently, she lifted her head to gaze at the moon, silent witness to their escape. Perhaps the goddess was watching, offering a silver blessing to these two souls bound by primal love. In that hush, Amara felt certain of one thing. Their story was not over. It had only just begun. The path ahead would be fraught with trials, memories to reclaim, enemies to face, packs to defy or persuade, but they would walk it side by side, forging a future that no silver collar or witch's rune could destroy. In the faint glow of moonlight, she leaned down and whispered, "I was meant for an alpha, but my mate is a beast. Let them call you that, if they must. I see the man behind the fury, the heart still beating, and I vow we will show them all. A beast can be tamed not by chains, but by love." As the moon climbed higher, bathing them in a gentle radiance, Kaelan's hand clasped hers, a silent promise that together they would transcend the shackles of the past, forging a new destiny that only a fated bond could create.